Hi all, Mr. Gallie here, and today we are going to be going through some of the best quotations from Sheila Burling in An Inspector Calls. Now, Sheila, like when you're writing any character essay, the important thing to think about is how does that character change during the play? Writing an essay where a character stays the same is never going to get you the best marks. So the important thing to think about is what's the journey that this character goes on? How does that relate to the themes that the author is presenting? And which quotations are the best ones in order to support this? Okay, so let's have a look at some of Sheila's most interesting moments in An Inspector Calls and talk about how we would analyze them. Okay, first of all, I'm going to make my face a little bit smaller. First of all, we're going to look at the way that Sheila talks at the start of the play. Now, early on, she describes her brother as Squiffy. This is her brother Eric. She describes him as a chump, and she describes him as an ass, right? Now, these words have kind of gone out of common usage, or certainly amongst young people. But what we're supposed to understand by Priestley's use of these three words is that Sheila is an immature character, right? That she's at a formal family dinner. Remember how the Burlings really cared about their presentation as members of the upper middle classes, right? They really liked the idea of being these upper class, civilized, dignified people. So Sheila, using what would have been considered kind of slang at that time, shows that she's quite an immature character, that she's not understanding and respecting the kind of social gravitas that her parents are trying to create around this evening. So that's something that can start you off with to show that she's an immature character at the start of the play. But much more interesting is this quotation here, where she says, "Oh, it's wonderful. Look, mummy, isn't it a beauty? Oh, darling." That's when she's talking to Gerald about the wedding ring the engagement ring that he has bought her. The engagement ring that in a very dramatic moment later in the play, she will hand back to him and say, "I think you'd better take this." But the key word we're looking at here is this shows that her superficial aspects of Sheila's character, right? When she's absolutely thrilled by how beautiful this ring is. She's over the moon. And we can see this with these hyphens that she's using in her speech. These hyphens here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all represent this idea that she's almost overwhelmed. She can't get her words out because she's so excited about the beauty of this wedding ring. Now, you could make the argument that this shows she's less interested in the wedding itself. She's less interested in the nature of the relationship on a serious adult level. And she's much, much more interested in how this thing looks and how pretty it is. So at the beginning of the play, none of these quotations are brilliant. And this is... there's much, much more interesting stuff that Sheila says later on. But you sort of need these things because you're establishing what her character is like at the start of the play. So in an essay, I wouldn't spend a huge amount of time on these, but I would perhaps have them in there to establish Sheila's initial immaturity and her superficial. Superficial, remember, means when you're only interested in the way things look, how shiny and glitzy and beautiful everything is, and not actually in anything deeper. Moving on. Right. Here, she says something far, far more interesting. This is when Sheila is listening to her father being inspected by the inspector, right? And she comes back at something that is said, which is this idea that the girls are essentially being treated as they're purely cheap labour, right? Labour means your workforce and the people you've got working in your business. And Sheila says, but these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. And again, we've got that nice hyphen there, which denotes the pause, perhaps drawing the attention of the audience to the fact that something quite poignant is being said, something quite important is being said at this moment in time. But the key word you're looking for here is juxtaposition, because what Sheila's doing is juxtaposing her father's belief that these girls are cheap labour with her belief that she's now coming to understand that these girls are actually people. And the juxtaposition there is so interesting, because what it really is, it's the juxtaposition. Sorry, juxtaposition is when you put two things next to each other to show the contrast between them. It's different to oxymoron. People get it confused with oxymoron sometimes. Oxymoron is when you put two things that shouldn't go together directly next to each other, like in the famous part of Romeo and Juliet where Romeo says, "Oh, brawling love, oh, loving hate." Now, obviously, how can you have loving hate, right? Those two things shouldn't go together. That makes it an oxymoron. Juxtaposition, which we're talking about here, juxtaposition is when you put two things near to each other in order to show the contrast between those two things. So, the idea that these girls are cheap labour, that is the capitalist idea that is embodied by Mr. Burling, that is represented by Mr. Burling. He believes that you should get people to work as cheaply as possible. You should keep your costs down. And indeed, it is your duty to do so, right? So his belief that these girls are cheap labour, they are a way of getting the job done cheaply and maximising their profits. This juxtaposes with what Sheila says, which is more to do with the ideas of socialism, which is embodied by the inspector, the idea that we should have equality, that we should share things, that there shouldn't be some people who are very, very rich and some people who are very, very poor. So what you've got in this quotation is the nice juxtaposition between the beliefs of Mr. Burling, that these girls are simply cheap labour, and Sheila's belief that they are people with dreams and hopes and aspirations and perhaps a desire to have a better life than the one they currently have. But more interestingly, it's not just the juxtaposition between what the two characters believe, it's also the juxtaposition between the beliefs of capitalism here and the beliefs of socialism. And we see that even though Sheila is from this very capitalist family, she is starting to come over to the ideas of socialism. Now, she then says, after being inspected by the inspector, she then says this quite simple line, but I think it's quite interesting. "So, I'm really responsible." Now, it's not the most interesting line. There's not an amazing metaphor in here that we can pick apart. But what we can look at is how she frames this sentence. And if you notice, interestingly, she doesn't say, "Am I really responsible?" That would be the normal way to frame this sentence. Am I really responsible? But she actually, as I've put down here, she frames that sentence in the positive. She says, "So I'm really responsible." Now think about it. When do we frame sentences in the positive? And the answer is, we do that when we kind of already know the answer. We've already accepted that something is true and we are looking for confirmation. Sheila, by framing her sentences, "I'm really responsible," instead of "Am I really responsible?" she's not actually asking this question. She's confirming something that she has already come to understand. And that shows, I think, a certain maturity in her character. That shows how much she's already starting to change, because she's not looking to ask this as a real question. She's not looking to get out of the blame the inspector's putting on her. She's simply confirming the thing that she has already come to accept. And while the other members of her family will continue to fight against this and say it's not their fault, they're not to blame, anybody would have done what we did in that situation, Sheila, by simply the way she puts this question together, is showing that she's already, having been inspected, she's already taken responsibility for what she's done, and she sees the importance of taking responsibility for what she has done. Here, and again, very, very simple quotation, not rich in language, not very, very deep in terms of the words that are used, but very interesting, because this is when she's talking to her parents and she said, "Of course he knows." Right? Sorry, this is when she's talking to Gerald and she says, "Of course he knows." Now, what it shows here is the power dynamic changing. The power dynamic means who's got the control of a situation, right? Who's the most important person in that situation? And what this shows here, by her telling in such a direct way, "Of course he knows," she is starting to assert more control and more dominance over the situation, right? And there's a heavy sense of irony here, because what Sheila's saying is, What Sheila's doing is, even though she's one of the younger characters and she's a female character, meaning that at the time she would have had the least power, the fact that she comes to understand what the inspector already knows, the fact that she comes to respect the inspector and doesn't think they've got any chance of covering this up, that shows that she takes on more power. And it's ironic because she is treated by the others as a character who shouldn't have this knowledge. She's called hysterical. She's basically told to shut up by her parents and treated as if she doesn't know what's going on. So the irony in this direct line is that she, by being more abrasive in the conversation, by saying, of course he knows, by stamping her authority in the situation, the irony is that this power dynamic is shifting. And by taking responsibility, Sheila starts to seem more intelligent, more wise than both her parents and Gerald. And the irony being, sorry, I know I've said that word a lot, but the irony being that by taking responsibility, she actually has a chance for change and to grow as a person, whereas they don't, even though she's the character who's treated with the least respect by the others. Right, now we come to an example where there's a much more interesting piece of language that we can use. This is when Sheila says, you mustn't try to build up a kind of wall between us and that girl. If you do, then the inspector will just break it down. Why is this interesting? So, the metaphor, of course, is the wall. And what she's saying to her mother at this point is, don't try and separate yourself from this girl. Sheila has already learnt from the mistakes of the others. Don't try and build up a wall between us and that girl. If you do, then the inspector will just break it down. Now, why is her metaphor of a wall interesting? It works on a few different levels. In one sense, the wall is a class barrier, right? Those people are over there. They're on the other side of that wall. We don't need to worry about those people because they are separated from us by this wall of class. The other interesting image about a wall is, of course, if you put something on the other side of it, you then don't need to look at that thing. And that's what she's accusing her mother of doing here, by putting a metaphorical wall up between Eva Smith and the Burlings. She's trying to both put her as a sort of different class that doesn't need to be worried about, but also, because of this wall, something that we don't even need to look at, we don't even need to think about. But then she develops this metaphor further, and what she says is, if you do, then the inspector will just break it down. So not only does she use the wall to show the stupidity of her mother and the fact that her mother believes that we are not connected to this girl, even though it was girls like these who made her money. We're not connected to this girl. But she takes it further, and she uses the same metaphor to talk about how the inspector will break it down. And therefore, Sheila does something very interesting here. She uses the same metaphor to both represent the stupidity of her own family and also the power of the inspector and his socialist beliefs. And what Priestley is doing by using that language is he's really building the character of Sheila and showing through her use of metaphor how she has become the most intelligent member of the family. She has become the wisest, most switched on member of the family, and is the one who is starting to come over and understand the inspector's and, of course, Priestley's more socialist beliefs that everyone is equal, rather than the Burling's capitalist beliefs that it's kind of everyone for themselves. Again, she uses another metaphor here which shows her deeper understanding, and again the contrast between herself and her parents. Mr. Burling says he's not going to give the inspector any more rope. That means basically, right, I'm not going to give you any more of my time, Inspector. And then the inspector says, oh, you don't need to give me any rope. And then Sheila, interestingly, twists her father's metaphor and says, no, he's the one, he's giving us the rope so that we'll hang ourselves. Now, again, the metaphor here is that the Burlings are basically being the masters of their own downfall. The more they talk, the more damage they do to themselves. The more things the Burlings say, the more harm they cause. And it's interesting that Sheila takes a metaphor originally used by her father and uses it in a much, much more interesting way that again shows a deeper understanding. So just like she did with the wall in the previous slide, here she talks about this rope. Her father says, no more rope for you, Inspector. I'm not giving you any time. And she's basically saying, don't you see, you idiot, that he's only giving us enough rope because we're the ones who are doing the hanging. We are hanging ourselves with our stupid words by trying to put a wall up between us and this girl, by trying to distance ourselves from us and this girl. It is us who are doing the hanging. So again, Sheila's use of metaphor is really interesting because it shows her deeper understanding. It shows that in contrast to her parents, she is starting to see things the way they actually are, rather than this worldview that the Burlings still want to hold on to. Now, another interesting quotation that comes later on is doesn't come later on, but it's when she's talking to Gerald and the revelation has come out about the affair that Gerald had with Eva Smith, or Daisy Renton as he knew her. Now, ironically, and going completely against our expectations, after he confesses to having the affair, she says, I rather respect you more than I've ever done before. Now, this is really interesting. Why on earth would you respect someone after they've just told you that they've had an affair? This is your fiance. This is the person you're supposed to be getting married to and spending the rest of your life with. And yet, here we are saying that, here she is, saying she respects them more than she ever has before. Now, why is that? Well, it's because of this key word down here, truth. What Sheila has come to understand is that the most important thing is to take responsibility, to tell the truth and take responsibility for what you have done. Now, this is why she can say that she respects Gerald more than she ever has before. And it completely goes against our expectations, because our expectations would be that she would be livid with him, that she would have no respect for him after he's just told her that he's cheated on her. But instead, because she has come to understand through the inspector that the most important thing is to tell the truth, to take responsibility for what you have done, she is now able to go completely against these expectations. And ironically, there's that key word again, ironically, she respects Gerald more for telling the truth about this terrible thing that he's done. Right, this is right towards the end of the play. This is the point when the Burlings are trying to work out, well, maybe this man isn't an inspector. If he's not an inspector, maybe we can get out of trouble here. Maybe there's not going to be a public scandal. And Sheila shows just how much she's changed. And she shows these two absolutely key themes within the play, which are acceptance and responsibility. And she says that's what's important, and not whether a man is a police officer or not. Her point here being that the important thing is to accept for what they've done. It doesn't matter whether it was one girl or 5 girls. It doesn't matter in a sense whether she's alive or obviously she'd much rather be alive and well. But that's not the point, is what she's saying. What she's saying is whether or not there's going to be a scandal, whether we're going to get into trouble, whether or not she's a real girl, none of that matters, because we did the things that we did. We are all responsible for doing the things that we did during the course of this play. And Sheila here is showing how much she has come to understand the inspector's words earlier in the play. This idea that there was a chain of events that connected things, that we are linked together in a chain, that we are all responsible for one another. And how if we do not learn these things, we will be taught in fire and blood and anguish. Sheila is coming to understand that what's important is what you did, taking responsibility for what you did and trying to be a better person, not whether there are consequences for that thing or not. The Burlings, Gerald, they are still only interested in the consequences and whether there will be some kind of fallout from this thing. But Sheila is not. And Sheila is saying that that's what's important. What we did is what's important, not whether the man is a police officer or not, showing how much she's changed and how much she sees the importance of acceptance and responsibility. Right. So those were your top quotations for Sheila. I hope you find that helpful, and I will see you next time.